Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support. If you would like to make sure that I can keep bringing you more content like this, then head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Welcome to Japan Station. I'm Tony Vega. All right, so if you're listening to this around the time it comes out, well, it's October of 2020, and that means it's Halloween season. So we're going to talk about some spooky stuff, Japanese ghost stuff, Yūrei, right, as they are known in Japanese. And I'm going to be talking to the guy who basically, in a way, I guess you could say, wrote the book on the subject, at least in English. Really, really interesting guy. But before we get to that, I have a quick announcement, and that is that I started an online shop. I'm going to be selling t-shirts and a couple other things now and then, all featuring designs inspired by Japan. It's going to be under the brand name of Kimito Designs, Kimito Designs.com. And I have a 10% off discount coupon code. It's going to be valid for the rest of 2020, and that is opening 10. I also have a 20% off discount code for the patrons. So if you want that, you got to sign up at japankyo.com/Patreon. Anyway, go take a look. I will be releasing more designs in the coming weeks and months. This is something I'm really excited about. There's still a lot of work I got to do, but it's just a fun new project that hopefully will also help support the stuff that I'm doing here, right? It does indirectly support this stuff too, but I would also love to grow that into its own thing. So again, kimitodesigns.com. All right, so let's get to my guest today, and that is Zack Davisson. He is an award-winning translator, writer, lecturer, expert on Japanese folklore, Yōkai, and of course, ghosts, as I mentioned earlier. He is also basically the go-to guy, the translator for the Mizuki Shigeru body of work, which is huge. And in case you're not familiar with Mizuki Shigeru, maybe you are aware of Gegege no Kitaro. So, of course, that is one of the biggest, most well-known manga/anime in Japan. And I think it's only in more recent years that it's started to take off in the West. And that is thanks in large part to Zack's work as the translator of pretty much all of that stuff, I think. Zack has also translated Satoshi Kon's work and a whole bunch of other stuff. Today, though, we are talking about Yūrei, Japanese ghosts. And that's because, like I said, Zack wrote a book about the subject. It's called Yūrei, the Japanese Ghost. And a second edition of the book just came out at the end of September. I highly recommend it. I happen to have read the first edition, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But if you're going to pick it up now, you may as well get the second edition. Has some updates in it. And you can find the link in the show notes. It's, of course, an Amazon affiliate link, or you can just go to japankyo.com/Amazon or get it wherever you get your books. It's out now. Go pick it up. The book goes into the history and interesting background information of Japanese ghosts. What makes them unique? What characterizes them? Are they really just like that girl in the ring, have long wet hair and a white kimono? Is that all they are? Or is there more to it? Well, we are going to talk about that today in the conversation that you're about to hear, but there is so much more interesting information in the book. So again, go pick it up. Yūrei, the Japanese Ghost. We are also going to talk about a really interesting experience that Zack had while he was living in Osaka in an apartment that may have been haunted. So regardless of what your stance is on ghosts or hauntings and all that kind of stuff, it's a really interesting story. So anyway, let's get to it. Here is my conversation with Zack Davisson.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
So then I'll start with where you start in the book, which is mentioning the apartment that was maybe haunted, that you lived in briefly. So could you explain, well, one, how you ended up there and what was strange about this apartment?
So to give you to talk about Kishigami Bunka, and Kishigami Bunka played such a huge role in the book as well. I have to give you a little bit of background on Japan and their housing market. So the way it works in Japan is that when you're renting an apartment, you generally don't just go and, look up listings. You go through, they have these things. The one we rented was called Mini Me, which sounds funny, but that was the actual name.
No Austin Powers involved?
Right. No Austin Powers. It basically meant mini because it's an apartment and me because you're, I don't know, however it works in Japan. But, that was the name of it. And you go there and they have these apartment listings. And so, this agent will set you up and walk you through one. And so that's just how you would rent apartments at the time. And there's this other thing in Japan that always really offends me because it was a custom that I never really grew up with. And it's called daking, which means respect money. And that's the literal definition of it. And basically what respect money is to put it bluntly, it's basically like a little bribe that you pay the apartment owner. It's like, imagine if you had to pay a deposit, but you never got it back. You're just giving them a big pile of cash, and it can be really expensive. Like this Reiki could be like 3 months rent, right? So you're basically giving them a thank you for deigning to rent to us. Here's 3 months, several $1,000s rent. So I always wanted to look for apartments that didn't have a daking option. And also I knew that, we weren't going to be there forever because we were already kind of planning our move back to the U.S. I was finishing up my master's degree. And so we're in this apartment, this complex, and I'm like talking to the guy and I'm like, here, look, here's our requirements. We only want to pay between this much rent and, we don't want to pay any daking. So whatever you've got to show us those, let us know. And he's like flummoxed because, he's like, well, there's not a lot of options there and blah, blah, blah. And he's trying to upsell us. And I think we kind of realized that we would not be upselled. He just gave us this look. He's like, could it possibly be? And then you saw it was almost like something out of an old horror movie. He reached under the counter and produced this dusty binder and slammed it. If it had been a movie, it would have landed on the counter with this ominous thump. Yeah. And what it was his binder of haunted apartments, which
that's awesome.
They legally have to do in Japan. If there's been a suicide there, or anything that you have where it somehow is a death-touched apartment, they have to be legally described as such, and no one wants to live there. So he brought out this binder, and I was just at that point, I was yeah. I mean, I was working on my master's degree anyways on Japanese ghosts as my studying topic. And, I'm just oh, it's going to be one of these. And he took us to a few different places. And these were just the worst apartments that you can imagine, right? Because you're not wanting to pay a lot of money, and on top of that, you are, you don't want to pay the raking. So one of the apartments that my wife, which was my wife at the time, Miyuki, vetoed instantly, had a shared shower outdoors, which meant basically you had to she's nope, that one's not going to fly. And it's okay, yeah, fair enough. And that one was actually, it was one of the nicer apartments, but she's nope, I'm not going to go outdoors every morning to use the bathroom. I'm fair enough. And so then I think we saw 2 or 3 apartments, I want to say it's the standard movie 3 because that's how it works, right? It's always the third pick. That's the one you go with. So let's say it was 3. And then he took us to Kishigami Bunka, and he went upstairs, and the apartment itself was just I couldn't believe it because there were dead flies just all over the place. And the guy, the landlord, he had just not even bothered to clean up, just this dead flies and everything. But the apartment itself, it was not bad. It was pretty spacious for the amount that we were paying, And the landlord's just it's well, you can clean it up. It'll be okay. And the weirdest thing about it, there was so much weird stuff about it, but the weirdest thing about it is that there was a wall separating the living room and the bathroom. And it was literally just a wall. I mean, you could stand on one side, you could stand on the other side. You could see there was a typical tiny little Japanese wall. But on one side of this wall was a door, and on the other side of the wall, there was not. So it was literally just a door that went nowhere. It would have opened up directly into the wall. And we're sitting there, you know, looking at the place, and the landlord just like looks at us. He's like, "Oh, by the way, never open that door." And so, you know, I mean, we did end up renting the place, and I was like, well, you know, if nothing else, I'll be able to, you know, like the part of me that's, you know, a writer is like, well, if nothing else, you know, I'll be able to write about this place later. But, you know, I also I felt like, you know, I've seen enough horror movies in my life, and almost all of them have someone, like, they require an act of stupidity in order for the main cast to have this awful experience. Or like, you know, someone's like, oh, hey, and Japanese folktales are actually full of that as well. Like there, you have so much stuff in Japan where it's like, hey, oh, there's all this awesomeness, but you know, never, and it's like always an arbitrary
Don't do this
rule. It's
one
like,
thing.
You know, never move that apple from the second shelf to the third shelf, you know, don't feed the gremlins after midnight. I mean, it's always this arbitrary rule that the people in the movie break. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to be the one smart person that is given an arbitrary rule and obeys it, and thus lives to walk out of the door the next day. So I didn't. I never opened the door. We actually had a big black tapestry sort of thing that we still have in our house here in the U.S., and we just sort of hung it over to hide the door. And, I mean, that was the end of the adventure of the door. But Kishigami Bunka also, I mean, there was so much creepy stuff about it. Like, it had, I think the other creepy thing was it had these prints all over the ceiling, and they looked like red children's hand and feet prints. And that was the freakiest thing about it, right? Because, like, I mean, handprints are bad enough, but you had actual, like, red footprints on the ceiling. And, like, we tried to scrub them off. We tried to scrub them off with bleach. And they would inevitably just show back up. And it was just like, okay, that's freaky. And then there was always, like, you know, there was always this sort of weird stuff that would happen. Like when you would sit in the kitchen, there was, like, this, you know, this outside wall would have this banging in it. Like, there was something inside, like, bang, 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 you know, trying to get out and everything. But eventually, you know, the scariest thing can become mundane once you realize that it's not really, you know, whatever there is not really going to hurt you, you know. So you just, like, kind of get used to it. But at the same time, there was just several little freaky things. Like, I remember one of the, like, both Miyuki and I had two just, like, really, really scary experiences. And, you know, nothing that obviously is going to make the news anywhere because it was just really personal. But, like, for me, the scariest one was I was just, like, you know, my wife went to bed earlier, and, like, we're lying in the futon next to each other, and I'm just up reading a book like I do a lot. And so I'm just, like, reading the book, and everything's fine. And across from us on our bedroom was a mirror. And so I'm just sitting there, and, like, I don't even know how to explain it other than just, like, I went from zero to just, like, abject terror in half a second through nothing. I was just, like, sitting there, and all of a sudden I was just like, oh, my God. I was just overwhelmingly terrified. And there was just some voice in my head was like, don't look in the mirror, Zach. You won't like what you'll see. And it wasn't like it was just some sort of instinct that was like, whatever you do right now, don't look in the mirror. So I just, like, closed my eyes, shut my book, turned off the light, and sort of, you know, shuddered there for a little bit until I finally went to sleep. But then the next day I told Miyuki about it, my wife about it. And we just, like, we turned all of the mirrors to the wall when we went to sleep after that. So we were just like, I don't know, man. House is sending you warnings. And one of those warnings is whatever's in the mirror at night is not something you want to see. So that just became part of our nightly ritual. It was like flipping the mirrors against the wall. I mean, just the mirror. We only had the one, so it wasn't that big a deal. We'd flip the mirror against the wall so that we couldn't see anything at night. And then Miyuki had probably the scariest experience, really, of all of us. And it was like, one night she just, you know, she had this dream that the hands on the ceiling were coming down and reaching her and pulling her. And she saw, like, this giant vortex in the ceiling, and that the hands were, like, pulling her towards it. And, you know, I just woke up to her just absolutely just screaming. And, like, I grabbed her. And she was just like, oh, my God, you saved my life. I was about to be pulled into this portal to the underworld. And, you know, from her perspective, I did. I just like managed to wake her up and save her, before she got yanked into it. But that was by far the scariest thing. But it was, the whole thing was interesting. It's years now, so of course it's a lot easier to talk about something that's years later. But even then, because we lived in this place, you'd have friends come over and like Japan being fairly matter of factly with its ghosts, almost every person would come in with like, oh yeah, there's definitely a Yūrei in here. I mean, you can just feel it the instant that you walk through the door that this is a haunted house, and I can see why they have a hard time renting it,
Right.
But so that was Kishigami Bunka, and when I first got there? I think we were there a little over 6 months.
Oh, okay. Huh.
Because we had just left our other apartment, and we were kind of looking for, because we were processing her K1 visa, her K1 visa, and we were just sort of like sitting there waiting. Essentially, we didn't know how long it would process, because when you're waiting for a visa to process, it can take a year, it can take a week. We just didn't know. So we were trying to find somewhere a little bit flexible that we could move when the time was ready. And I think we ended up staying there about 6 months.
Right. It's I can't help but notice the pun here, but you wanted to avoid the Rei Kin, but you ended up with the Rei in your house, right?
I've never even thought about it that way, but yes, that is fairly accurate.
Yeah. So of course, Rei is a more you can use that to mean ghost or spirit. Rei can mean that.
Well,
so
the way Japanese works is that Japanese has a lot of homophones. There's so many homophones in Japanese, and so the day of Yūrei is not the same day of Reikin. They just sound alike, but it's just like in English. When things are spelled differently, even though they sound the same thing. Japan has that, but they just have a million more of them, and almost all of Japanese humor is thus based on homophones, because it's funny to misunderstand. Oh, you didn't mean just like jokes like that. Like that would be that's a pretty hilarious.
Yeah.
Hilarious joke in Japanese, actually.
Yeah, I can't help but make those. So.
Oh, yeah.
I love those. All right, so by that point, you were already interested in ghosts and folklore. How was it that you got interested in that, so much so that you ended up writing your master's on Yūrei?
I've always been, it's just one of those things where, I've just been born interested in folklore and things like that. I can't ever remember a time in my life when I wasn't, like when I was, being a child of the 1970s, I grew up on this TV show called In Search Of, which was hosted by Leonard Nimoy, who's Spock from Star Trek, and it was always like, in search of Bigfoot, in search of, the Loch Ness Monster. And I just love stuff like that. I used, I'd buy the magazines, like all the sort of like, I don't know, I like the idea that the world is kind of a weirder place than we think of, and I know I'm not particularly serious about it. Like I often refer to myself as a supernatural agnostic, in which that, I think it's fun and I like it and I like to sort of play with it. But like, if you really like, my life was on the line, if you wanted me to bet money, I would say, no, there's probably not a Bigfoot, there's probably not a Loch Ness Monster. But I think that it would be, the world is a funner place if you believe in it. So I allow myself to indulge in some strange beliefs every now and then. And those are some of them. And like, I've, like I said, always been like that. So like when I lived in Scotland, like I would go to like ferry bridges and things like that. Cause I just love stuff like that so much, like Doomvegan Castle with its fairy flag. And I think it just adds such a richness to life, mythology and stories, it's salt to life. It just makes the world a more interesting place. And so when I went to Japan, it was really like hitting the jackpot. I mean, there's nowhere that I can think of, that lives with its mythology and lives with its spirituality and lives with its gods and monsters on a daily basis more than Japan. It's like Scotland has it, but it's always removed. It's like, yes, we have the fairy folk and yes, we have the Loch Ness Monster, but you don't go into every single person's house and find a fairy shrine in their kitchen. You don't. It's taken as something like quaint and touristy and something that happened a long time ago. Whereas Japan, like their folklore is very real and now, it's not something that people used to believe and let's present it as something like that. It's very much a part of the day to day. And that's especially true more than anything with Yūrei, with ghosts. They are so much a part of the day to day, and that was so apparent to me when I first moved there, because I moved there in the summertime, which is in Japan is high ghost season. And that's when their ghosts come back, and so. And my birthday also coincidentally is August 15th, which is Obon. And so, where I lived in Nara Prefecture, on Obon, they would have this, if you're not familiar with Obon, sorry, I should clarify, Obon is the traditional Japanese festival of the dead. And it's really like probably the second largest festival they have in Japan, probably after New Year's, is Obon. It's a time when the entire country shuts down and no one goes to work, and and all of the ghosts comes back. So basically all of the dead, and it's not like Halloween at all. A lot of people say, oh, like Halloween. It's like, it's not like Halloween at all, because the ghost coming back is a very good thing. This is not scary in any way. Obon is your beloved grandparents coming back for, it's more like, imagine if we had the American Thanksgiving every year, but with all of our dead relatives instead of our living ones. And that's pretty much what Obon is like. It's awesome. It's awesome that Granny and Granddad and Great-Granny and Great-Grandpa pop by, to visit you. And you put out, delicious food for them. And it's like this whole sort of thing. And like, and Nara goes crazy. They light the 10,000 lanterns of Nara Park and, and all this other stuff. And so it was just amazing to me. And what was also amazing to me when I was there is like I was just so fascinated by it, and it was really hard because I would ask, my coworkers, I would ask Japanese friends, I'm like, what does this mean? What is it? And a lot of them really didn't know because it's just so commonplace that a lot of time when something is just normal to you, you don't ever really ask why. It's not a thing that most people really query in their life, and then I think that's true especially of traditions and holiday traditions, like when we eventually did come back to the United States together, it was Yuki, my wife Yuki's turn to sort of ask those questions and realize that there's a lot of odd things we do here that never once in my life have I questioned, and it took someone completely new to ask those questions. Like, she's like, hey, why do you nail socks to your wall? And I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, every Christmas you nail socks to your wall. Like, why do you do that? And she was talking about Christmas stockings, And I'm like, you know what? I don't honestly know. We just do it. I've been doing it since I was a kid. I could tell you that it's fun, but I could tell you maybe a guess, but I really couldn't tell you the origin or why or where, I just know that that's what we do, like, oh, it's Thanksgiving. Why do we have to eat a turkey every year? Why can't we have salmon, or why can't we have, roast beef or something like that, and it's just all these traditional things that sometimes it really kind of takes someone that hasn't grown up with it to ask these questions. And, and I just had all these questions and I was like, well, a lot of people didn't know. But of course, there were answers, but they were all locked away in books and in Japanese. And I couldn't speak any Japanese or read or write any Japanese. I went over to Japan and I was speaking essentially no Japanese whatsoever, as a lot of people do when you go over on the JET program, which is what I went for. In fact, they're specifically looking for people who don't speak Japanese because they want people that, you're an English teacher. So they want people that will help Japanese people practice their English. They already have a lot of Japanese speakers in Japan, so they don't need to import them. What they need to import is English speakers. So, but that became really my motivation for studying, for diving in and just because I wanted to know all of this stuff. And if I wanted to learn, if I wanted to have answers to my questions, then I needed to, Japanese language was the key that unlocked all of those doors. As well as just some other things, even in studying, I found the manga artist Mizuki Shigeru, who I absolutely fell in love with. And his work also deals with Japanese folklore and Yōkai and things like that. And it had never been translated. So, and I often tell people like that when they're like, what do I need when what's your best advice to studying Japanese? And I'll be like, honestly, one of my best advice is motivate yourself by finding something that only exists in Japanese, because that will give you the motivation to do it. At least it did for me, was to find whatever that is that you just absolutely love. And the only way that you get to have it is by learning Japanese. And that was me. So, and then, I just did a bunch. I wrote several articles for local newspapers, local foreign newspapers and stuff like that. And then at some point in time, I decided, well, maybe, while I'm here, I found an option to do a distance master's degree from the University of Sheffield. And I went through their language course. And when it came time to pick your focus, because you had to write a master's dissertation to graduate, I picked Yūrei. I picked Japanese ghosts because it was something that was really, especially at the time, I mean, there's a little bit more now, but at the time there was, absolutely nothing written about it in English. And I was like, well, this will be something interesting that I can really dive into. And I mean, honestly, at the time I was thinking about it too, like a lot of people's like, what do you do with a master's degree? It's like, well, maybe if I do a good job with this, maybe I can turn it to a book or, do something with it, and that was basically that's the whole history of me in Japan's ghosts, I guess.
Yeah,
maybe more than you were asking for, but
no, that's exactly what I wanted to know, and I happen to be a JET participant as well, so it's always
nice. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah,
I was in Kobe, so not too far from where you were.
Oh, what year were you there?
2010 to 2013, and I studied abroad in Osaka in 2007 to 2008. So,
nice. So you came after me.
Yeah.
Well, of course, because Kansai is the best.
Hell yeah!
Right?
Yeah.
You go to Japan you go anywhere else in Kansai. You didn't really go to Japan. I mean, come on.
No, I love Kansai. Whenever I can, I still go back. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You know what? I at least a couple times I've had people just for whatever reason ask me like, do you have Reikan, right? Which is the ability to like sense or see ghosts is like Reikan. Yeah. Again, that Rei that we were talking about, right? But I don't think I've ever been asked that in the US. And yes, I guess that's an anecdotal experience that I'm sharing, but nevertheless, I found it interesting.
Speaking of Reikan, I was going to say that's another interesting thing because my wife, Miyuki, is very famous amongst her friends for her Reikan. In fact, to the point to where her friends will use her as like a mini ghost detector if they're like buying a house or moving to a new apartment or something, along with their house inspector and things like that. They'll invite my wife along to see, it's like, hey, is there any ghosts here? As your as a little ghost detector. So. Yeah. I'm very familiar with Reikan because, her Reikan is very strong.
And I guess she's very patient with you if that's the case, or is that why, like, you guys get along?
I mean, she's just, it is what it is. Like, it's nothing that she's super interested in. It's just, something else, just one of those things in her life. She's like, I know my husband, It is what it is, Like she'll do stuff all the time where I'm like, oh, let's go to this scary place. He's like, no, I don't want to go to that scary place. He's like, for you, it's just like kind of fun because you don't actually have any Daycom. But like for me, I have to see all and feel all this scary stuff, so it's not nearly as much fun for me. So
right.
That's fair.
Yeah. All right. So then let's kind of dig in a little bit more into Yūrei. So So basically, they are a type of ghost, but they also can be qualified as yokai. Is that accurate? Like, what exactly is a Yūrei? Let's just say.
Yeah, and that's such a complicated question, and the reason why it's is because there's no answer. I mean, one of the things about folklore and history, this kind of folkloric history, is that you'll find a lot of opinions. As I often tell people, like it's not science, right? We're not actually looking for animal classifications. There's no kingdom, genus, species, and phyla here, So what you can do is just like basically like how do you feel about it is really the biggest answer there, because I know how I feel about it, but I also know that other people, people I love, like and respect, will feel about it differently. So I basically present my idea on the subject, but and then I know others will disagree, and that's fine. That's the way it's been going since Inyo and Yanagata Kunio first wrote their first yokai books in the Meiji period. They disagreed with each other, and so part of the tradition of Yokaiology as it is, yokai gaku is violently disagreeing with each other on this exact question. So I think my thoughts is that, you have, Yūrei are obviously a type of ghost, they are, and what is a ghost, right? A ghost, by modern classifications is the spirit of the dead, but that's a fairly relative definition of ghosts. Ghosts, if you look back even maybe a couple, like 100 years or so, you'll find that ghost was a generic term for spirits, for sprites, for spirits. Like probably the best example is H.R. James' book's Ghost of an Antiquary, which is one of the foundations of horror fiction. And it's literally called Ghosts of an Antiquary, but there are nothing inside the book that we would, by modern definition, classify as a ghost, because the word had not gained that meaning yet, But, using modern definitions, like the ghost is the spirit of the dead. So, okay, we can all agree on that. And Yūrei are definitely the spirits of the dead, So that's what makes them Yūrei. They are things that were once alive and are now no longer alive. But they are also specifically Yūrei, which makes them like a distinct folkloric creature, to my mind. Like, to my mind, ghost is a fairly general term, of which Yūrei are a very specific classification of ghosts. If you want to think of it as like how vampires and mummies are both the undead, but one's a vampire and one's a mummy. Right, and so that's kind of how I think of it, Yūrei are also, they're very specific. And I think that's one of the other big differences with Yūrei, is that as a folkloric creature, they're far more specific than what we consider to be the Western idea of a ghost. Like, the Western idea of a ghost can really be anything. If you look at popular fiction, in some, a ghost are unseen forces. In another movie, you'll have a ghost that is, almost indistinguishable from a living person, and, and then you get to like probably some of the most famous ghosts in Western fiction. The one that everyone knows, even though they probably wouldn't call them ghosts. If I was like, hey, name 5 ghosts, they wouldn't spring to your mind, but they should, because they're the ones everyone knows, which are Charles Dickens's, A Christmas Carol. So you have the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas future, and the ghost of Christmas present, which they are absolutely ghosts, but they're using ghosts in the way that it was defined during that era, not to be, no one is claiming that the ghost of Christmas past was once a living creature that died, They are using the word ghost as it used to be used. Like I said, it's just a generic term for spiritual forces in the world beyond the ken of living things. But those are also ghosts. And everyone that watches A Christmas Carol every year, which is the Western movie, that is remade essentially once per decade. So basically every generation gets their own version of the Christmas Carol. Absolutely no one looks at that movie. Well, not no one, someone maybe, but very few people come out of that and say, well, those weren't ghosts. Why did they call those ghosts? Yūrei, on the other hand, are very specific. They follow very specific cultural rules. They have a very specific appearance. They look like something, and it's enough to where if I was to give you, something very non-Yūrei-ish and say, oh, look, that's a Yūrei, then many people would, there'd be sort of like a cultural dissonance there. It's like, well, that's not a Yūrei. It doesn't look anything like a Yūrei,
Yeah.
That's a ghost. That's not a Yūrei. As to the question of whether or not they're yokai, and once again, that goes into an even bigger question. So yokai as a term is just like ghost. It's transformed a lot. And what it's, it never was really a term in Japanese until around the Meiji era. So it was not in well use. So you have generations of what we now call yokai existing in Japanese fiction and storytelling, but never actually called yokai, because that was not the term in use. That term came into use around the Meiji period. And it came into use specifically because a group of scholars and writers were attempting to sort of, for the first time in history, codify, capture, and classify this part of Japanese culture that no one had ever bothered really to write about before in a scholarly way. It just existed. And with the transition of the Meiji period and the modernization of Japan, There was a few people who were just like, hey, maybe we should get this stuff down on paper before it vanishes forever in the face of modernization. And that's where we get Yōkai from.
Right.
But it also meant that, that there's not a lot of agreement. So, like even in modern times, like I think Matt Alt and I, who's also a writer, who I love his work, respect him, he's a good friend, but we completely disagree on this because he looks at the more pop culture standpoint, especially with modern Japan, where yokai have specifically, the word is specifically transferred to mean sort of Japanese monsters, and Japanese traditional folkloric monsters. So he gives yokai a very specific meaning, of which he would not include Yūrei amongst it. He does not think that Yūrei, he thinks that Yūrei are ghosts and they are not yokai. I disagree. I take, because he was one of the people who was sort of like the work I studied, I take Mizuki Shigeru's viewpoint on the fact that yokai is a very broad word that encompasses not only the ghosts of Japan and the creatures of Japan, but all of the world's monsters. So, Mizuki Shigeru, when he would write his yokai encyclopedias, he would talk a lot about Western yokai, so he would include Bigfoot, he would include the Loch Ness Monster, like all of that got included as yokai. And so that's my take of it there. It's like, I tend to agree with him, and I think that yokai as a word is a much broader definition. I think that it can include, that it's a vast umbrella term.
Yeah.
Under which follow these. So I would say, as a long-winded to answer your question, yes, Yūrei are ghosts. Yes, they are also yokai. And yes, they are also specifically what they are, which is Yūrei.
Yeah. So interesting, just right now, as we're speaking in September of 2020, there's a Japanese drama airing on TV in Japan right now that's called Yōkai Share House. And
really? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, so it's I'm not watching. I actually just watched one episode specifically because I was going to talk to you and I wanted to see like how they portrayed the yokai, because perhaps, maybe, I guess you could say the most famous Yūrei, or easily one of the most famous ones, Oiwa, is one of the characters. So the story
is it a drama or is it an animation or what is it?
No, it's a live action. I mean, it's a dorama in the general sense of it's kind of like comedic,
sure.
Right? It's a little bit comedic, but it's not particularly scary. They're all kind of depicted in a kind of comedic way. And I just thought it was interesting that Oiwa was being bunched in with like Oni, and I think there was a Zashiki Warashi, and I think it's a total of like 5 or 6 yokai that all live together in this house. So
that's awesome.
Just very interesting that there you go. There is one case right there of right now in contemporary times, people clumping in Yūrei with
them. Yeah. And I mean, and I think that they, like I said, I think that most people in Japan would agree with that, but they're also, it's like, it's one of those things where like, what counts as a monster, it's not a scientific term, monster. And the way we use monster in English also, it's just as open-ended, because you're like, all right, what's a monster? Give me a list of, 5, monsters. You're like, all right, vampires, werewolves, and, let's just say, I don't know, mummies, because I'm thinking of the Universal monsters, or like the Frankenstein monster. I'm like, okay. But then we often hear serial killers referred to as monsters, would you add them on the list? Are serial killers monsters? And a lot of people are like, well, yeah, I think that they could make the list, but they're human, and, but somehow not. So
yeah.
There's a lot of room for interpretation, as there should be, as there should be. And I also think that, folkloric definitions, change over time. There's a real danger in trying to define and capture and preserve folklore under glass, I feel like, because then it is no longer serving its purpose. It's no longer folklore. It's no longer the lore of the folk, You're treating it as a historical artifact and not as a present part and important part of the modern world, because once folklore is no longer relevant to the folk, it is, to my mind, no longer folklore at that stage, Then it's just, maybe it's myth, or maybe it's history, or, maybe it's something else, but it's no longer relevant, in folklore.
Right,
And
right.
I love folklore too, because new folklore is constantly being generated.
Yeah.
New ghosts are constantly being generated, and that's part of the deal too, right? It's just like, as we retire certain legends, because like say Oiwa is suddenly, so Oiwa is on a TV show now, and they're making a joke about it. Well, just like, and I was just talking about this because I was interviewing manga artist Go Tanabe for another thing. We were both talking about this. We're like, we think that, because he does a lot of work with H.P. Lovecraft, and we both think that H.P. Lovecraft has really lost his ability to be scary. Cthulhu has become too much of the pop culture nowadays.
Right.
And so it's really hard in the modern world to scare someone with Cthulhu because he's just lost his power. And so maybe Oiwa has lost her power as well.
Yeah.
But I guarantee that there's a new ghost brewing up somewhere, some new legends, someone to take her spot for sure.
Yeah. All right. So then let's go into what are the characteristics of a Yūrei? What distinguishes it as its own unique category?
And especially looking at ghosts, I mean, there's the easiest one, and the one that people usually grip on, which is the visual appearance. And I'm like, yeah, sure, that's a factor. Yūrei look a very specific way. And that costume, you can, it's one of the coolest things, like one of the other coolest things I think about studying a lot of this stuff is that, just like my wife asking, like, why do you nail socks on the wall? Like, if you follow those trails back, you will find an answer. I mean, maybe it's not going to be a 100% answer, but you generally do find an answer. And so when you look through Yūrei, like, why do they look like that? What's up with the crazy hair? Because they generally have this long black hair, and they wear these white kimonos, and they have these white faces and all this stuff. And you can trace all of that back. Like there is actually a foundational Yūrei that ended up looking like that, and it was the painting of Mario Okyo, who did this painting of he had a dream, just like Miyuki had a dream one night of this vision of a ghost of his old lover, a woman named Oyuki, and when he woke up the next morning, because he was Mariama Okyo, he painted her. He painted her exactly as he saw her in his dream, and he had this this reputation. He was just such a famous artist that, as well as not just a famous artist, he was an incredibly famous artist. He was the painter to shoguns. He was the king of all artists. And he was also known for his absolute devotion to realism. So he was a fanatical Buddhist who believed that everything that exists is here. Here and now. And that artists who need to imagine or pull from a fantasy world are basically betraying Buddha, who has given you all that you need. This world, this grass, these mountains, like it was all here for you. And so you didn't need to invent anything. Your job as an artist was to capture what Buddha had already placed here, what was already here. And so because he had painted this ghost, he's like, hey, Japan, this is a ghost. Everyone's like, oh, well, Mariama Okyo said so. It must be true. And so other artists started copying his version of what a ghost looked like. And then that ended up sort of, transitioning through time. And especially it was picked up, like a lot of the traits were picked up by Kabuki theater, who, when Kabuki theater started, one of the things about Kabuki theater is that they really needed to have, just like they needed to have costumes and like visual characteristics that would let people know lickety split what character was on screen. And so that really worked well for Kabuki theater. And a lot of the aspects like the big hair and all of that comes from Kabuki theater, because they were trying to, they were creating visual special effects, and like someone would come up with this cool idea, and like the hair was a great idea because you could use this visual effects thing where like you had someone hiding underneath the stage, and as a character came out, like they could suddenly fill the stage with like astronomical amounts of hair, and it was really freaky looking. So a lot of that comes from that. And that's sort of like the visual aspect. But what I think really makes Yūrei, and what really defines them as opposed to other supernatural ghosts in particular, is that the reason for Yūrei to exist is that they want something, right? That is their meat and fuel. And without that, they cannot exist. Like, they need desire to bind them to the earth. And that's how you fight a Yūrei, essentially. Is you have to either fulfill their desire, which will make them dissipate, or somehow assuage them, because they are just living beings of desire. And like Western ghosts, like you have a lot of Western ghosts where, you'll hear them described as like looped pieces of tape, mindlessly repeating the same action over and over again and things like that. And Yūrei don't do that. Yūrei do not mindlessly repeat. They don't wander from hall to hall. They literally want something, and it is this desire that is their fuel. And that's how you get rid of them, is by finding out what they want. And sometimes some of the stuff that they want is often it can be either really this powerful drive, or it can be really like almost nothing. Like one of my favorite Yūrei stories is the story of a lord and a lady who owned this great mansion, or this great estate with many servants and all this stuff. And one day the lady of the mansion was woken in the middle of the night as someone tapped her on her shoulder, and she looked up and she saw this vision of a young lady that was a servant at the house. And the young lady just looked at her and said, "Thank you," and then disappeared. And the woman found out later that the servant had died. And so the servant must have died thinking, "Oh, I forgot to thank my mistress." And so she manifested as a Yūrei with this desire to say thank you. And once that thank you is said, boom, she has nothing else here to hold on to,
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's the bigger difference. The visually is sort of the surface difference, and it's easy to, and it's one of those things like you'll see people bring Yūrei, especially into Western films, because it's so visually dynamic, and they'll copy over just the costume, right? Yeah. But they won't copy anything that comes with the costume, right? So they're basically what you have is you end up with Western ghosts cosplaying as Yūrei, because they bring all of the face but none of the soul.
Right. Yeah, that's so. I mean, generally you do hear, Yūrei are scary, and there's tons of scary stories. But it's so interesting to see that there's these kind of innocent stories as well with Yūrei, right? Yeah.
Oh, there's so many. Yeah, there's so many. Because Yūrei don't necessarily a lot of it. It doesn't have to be, necessarily a scary thing, or it doesn't have to be, I don't know. It can be. There's so much, and there's really some really funny stories about Yūrei out there as well. But the scary stories are obviously that also has, hits with kabuki theater, because kabuki theater realized that scary Yūrei sell really well, and so they're the ones who really amped up the violence and gore and vicious part of the Yūrei storytelling. So most of the ones you'll see on screen, I mean, and that's true of a lot of Japanese cinema, comes from the kabuki theater traditions.
Right. Yeah, these stories of love and betrayal and murder and lust and all these things, right? And
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Which, in the book, you lay out this sort of the history that really, of course, there's long ties that go back, much, much further back. But the Edo period seems to be really when this all kind of solidified. And as you were saying with kabuki,
absolutely.
There was also this kind of boom in ghost stories, right? So I just found it so interesting how, I guess it's not surprising, but it's kind of like when money comes into play, people all just kind of, this one unified idea of a Yūrei really becomes the thing that we eventually know today, right?
Oh, yeah. And that's true of almost anything. Commercialization leads to a solidification of ideas, and you can see that in anything, look at, like I just said, the fairy folk, if you look at the Fae of Britain versus when the Victorian era, when people like Arthur Rackham started to do his illustrations of fairy folk, well, then that became the fairy folk. Arthur Rackham's vision of the fairies of England is still our vision, he just, and I think also the example that almost everyone can hold on to is that if you think of Santa Claus, you're thinking of Thomas Nast's Santa Claus. He drew the Santa Claus that became everyone's, but very few people could actually tell you that. And if you're not an academic, if you're not a folklore researcher, or just someone who enjoys this sort of trivia, few people are going to be able to tell you it's oh yes, the vision of modern Santa, comes from Thomas Nast, blah, blah, blah. And, Arthur Rackham had created all these visions of fairy tales, blah, blah, blah. As stuff commercializes, that it does solidify. And, the Edo period also not only money, but another thing about the Edo period is that they also had peace. And peace is generally when horror stories really boom. Very few people have any interest in horror stories when the actual world is horrible.
Right.
So you're not finding a lot of people in the middle of, a bombed out zone in World War II waking up in the morning and saying like, boy, what I really need today is to write a horror story, And so horror stories generally come from times of plenty and peace when you're more like a little more free to play with the grave, as I say it, because it's not real anymore. It's not as real. It's not as scary. If you look even like at the, like the Western traditions of like H.P. Lovecraft and everything, like when did most of that stuff get written? A lot of it got written or had its feeds in, the Roaring 20s and the 20s and things like that. And then later in the 1930s, you're just not getting as much horror stories, coming during the Great Depression, for example,
Right.
Because people are already bummed out. And obviously there's always exceptions to that, of course, but that, that was it for Japan. So Japan had, before that, they had the Sengoku Jidai. They had centuries of civil war, just constant civil war. Finally, someone won the battle, and the person that won the battle was just like, "Hey, no more war. Shut down all internal fighting for the most part. I mean, not all, because that's impossible. And all of a sudden, peasants, like not even peasants, I shouldn't say, but everyone in Japan started to do better. They were a little bit healthier. They started to eat 3 meals a day instead of 2. They started to have more leisure time. They did start to have more extra money, and that led to this boom in entertainment industries. That led to a boom in kabuki theater, which was invented in 1603, along with the start of the Edo period. That led to printing presses, printing stuff out. And the biggest factor that, like, I shouldn't say the biggest factor, because it's really like this perfect storm of ingredients that came together of literature, kabuki theater, and then the other one was this parlor game that was really popular at the time called Hyaku Monogatari Kaidankai, which was this immensely popular game where people would get into, you'd invite all your friends over and you'd light 100 candles and you would take turns telling spooky stories, and at every spooky story you'd extinguish a candle and the room would get darker and darker and darker and you'd get scarier and scarier, and supposedly if you extinguished the 100th candle, it would evoke this monster that would manifest in your house. But of course no one ever found out because they said no one was ever brave enough. Someone would always call quits before you got to that 100th candle. So all of these things really came together to create the Edo period, of the Edo period yokai boom. And especially, artists and writers, they're not dumb. They see that the public is fascinated with the supernatural. And so they start to create prints, artwork featuring these, and they all just fed off each other. Like kabuki theaters would create a new play. Something would happen like Oiwa being like a classic example where there was a sort of like local sort of obscure folklore legend. Someone took that and made this play of it. Play was an enormous hit. Artists started making art, from that. Other writers started picking up on that. Another writer over here is like, oh, that play Yotsuya Kaidan's a huge hit. We need to get on that ghost stuff. Boom, the Ghost of Kasane Swamp is written, which is almost a carbon copy of Oiwa, but nobody cares because it's also awesome, Yeah. And just, all of it feeding on each other and really escalating to the point that led to like a lot of bubbles to its ultimate explosion, because by the time Japan eventually ended its realm of peace or its world of peace in the Edo period and got contact with the West had science, whereas Japan had superstition. Yeah. And it was clear to everyone in power that science was the more powerful tool. So they actively went on sort of like scrubbing Japan of superstition in favor of a scientific mindset.
Just one last related to Yūrei, one last question about Oiwa. You mentioned in the book how a lot of people, like actors or people involved in the entertainment industry, they will go to the supposed site of Oiwa to pay their respects. And I mean, we don't have to get into the story itself because that's kind of long. But I'm wondering, being that you did research on this and wrote a book about it, have you visited that place?
I have not actually been there. I always feel a little bit bad about it because I did dedicate her my book to her just in case. Yeah.
Where exactly is it, by the way?
What's that?
Where
it's in this place called Tamiya in Tokyo. So, and living in Kansai was a bit of a trek to get out there.
Yeah.
And I ultimately just didn't have the time to. So one of these days I'll go up there. But I mean, and that's one of the other parts, like I said, like this kind of stuff in Japan, like the folklore, it's real. People live with it.
Yeah.
And that's one of them. There's this thought, and cursed productions are nothing new. Of course, theater is full of superstition. If you've ever worked in a theater, like if you're running a production of Hamlet, you're never supposed to say, or not Hamlet, of Macbeth. Like the actors are never supposed to say Macbeth, right? You always have to refer to it as the Scottish play when you're doing, and you can never cheer someone who's about to go on stage. Like, you're never allowed to wish them well. That's where the slogan of break a leg comes from. Because you wish people ill before they go out to go on stage. If you say like good luck, then you essentially doom them, right? So, and part of the superstition of the theater of Japan is that if you're playing the character of Oiwa, if you're making money off of her tragic death, you're supposed to go to her grave and say sorry about it. So I did apologize to her. Like I said, I dedicated the book to her and apologized to her. So and that seemed to be okay. She seemed to be happy with that.
Yeah. That's okay then. So what changes came in the new edition of the book?
Yeah, so we're just putting out the paperback. And my favorite thing about the new edition is that I got to fix all of the atrocious typos and grammar errors that made it through. So I was very excited about that.
Yeah.
But I mean, other than that, we added a few new translated stories to the back.
Okay.
I went through the whole book, and it was a really interesting experience going through it because it was a book that I wrote in Japan. And to me, it was so fascinating to see the difference between a book written in Japan versus like my current books like Kaibyo, The Supernatural Cats of Japan, that I wrote here in the U.S. because to my mind, I could clearly see the difference of me thinking in Japanese versus thinking in English, because Yūrei to me reads like someone who is putting together sort of like Japanese sentence structure in their head into English, which is what I was doing at the time, obviously, because that's what I was so immersed in. But I also didn't want to change it too much. Like, I was like, it is a good book. It is what it was when I wrote it. And I wanted to sort of preserve that. So I made a few little minor updates to it. I added a few little bits here and there because, new stuff that had come in since then. It was like, oh, I wish I had had the chance to add that. So I'll just put that in. But not enormously. It wasn't like a full overhaul because reading it, I was like, wow, it's a good book as it is.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I read the first edition, but nevertheless, I enjoyed it. I like the stories in the back and so, the whole thing from beginning to end. So yeah, it was a great book.
Apologies for the grammar errors and typos. Those will absolutely be fixed.
Awesome. Okay. Just last thing, you're constantly working on new stuff. You've put out so much stuff. Of course, all the Mizuki Shigeru related stuff. Anything, recent, like something that's about to come out or just came out that you would like to let people know about?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I always am working on new stuff. My recent thing, I'm trying to think of what, I've got several new books that I'm working on.
Okay.
I think like the translation stuff I did, I just finished something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, which is Mizuki Shigeru's adaptation of Tono Monogatari, which is, just one of those foundational works of Japan. That's what I was talking about. So back in the Meiji period, one of the authors that was attempting to capture Japan's folklore before it vanished as science changed the country was this guy named Yanagita Kunio. And he wrote this book called Tono Monogatari, which is Tales of Tono, where he basically did field research, just trying to capture it all, just like last chance to get this stuff and preserve it for future generations. And he saw this, he saw these stories, he saw this folklore just like just like disappearing forever because it was all oral traditions, right? No one had ever bothered to write even a word of it down before. So he went out to the Tono region and he wrote it down so it could be preserved for future generations. And Mizuki Shigeru did a comic book version of that, which I've been wanting to work on forever, and I finally got it translated. So that piece is coming out through Drawn and Quarterly. And I'm very excited about that. I also have like I talked about Gotanabe a little bit. I work on his Lovecraft manga. Those are fantastic. And my new book that I'm working on a couple new books. I really need to buckle down and write more. I'm working on one, which is basically like we did the supernatural cats of Japan. So we're following up with like a few different supernatural animals. And I'm doing my next book on tanuki, which I think will be a lot of fun. So I'm working on my tanuki book right now.
Awesome. Wow.
Yeah, and I'm doing like a few other, like I did like a little Amabie zine, because I think the Amabie is so fascinating right now. Like the Amabie is just like, is watching folklore in action, and I think it is the single most fascinating thing as a folklorist to happen during my lifetime, because you've seen the Amabie shift from absolute obscurity to where no one could have ever told you what, very few people could have ever told you what an Amabie was, 10 seconds before this all happened, before COVID all happened. And now you're actually seeing the Amabie like start to appear in shrines and dedicated Shinto shrines in Japan. And so you're actually getting to see the what I call the evolution. So like one of the things about yokai is that, like, what's the difference between a kami and a yokai is a question that you get asked a lot. And the really big difference is one is worshipped and one is not. And so you're seeing the Amabie move from obscurity to yokai to kami, because now Amabie is actually being worshipped, which then elevates it in the rank to kami. So it's been fun to watch.
Yeah. So just for anybody that's not aware, Amabie is this kind of mermaid-like creature that is like, they say, like when you see an image of it, it's supposed to ward off like bad, especially like epidemic, like sickness, that kind of stuff, right? Yeah.
And it's one of many that existed at the time. And it's kind of interesting, it's like a lot of things like that. There were so many different prophetic yokai, and it could have been any of them. Any of them could have been plucked from obscurity to be the symbol. But I think the reason why it was Amabie is Amabie was the cutest. So I really their stories are all the exact same, but the character design for Amabie was cuter. So that's how Amabie won the sort of race, just by virtue of cuteness. And that's also a very Japanese thing.
Yeah. And ultimately, I mean, the reason why it blew up is because of social media. I mean, that's where it spread, right? So you can figure
absolutely.
The cute one will spread more on social media, right?
Yeah, totally.
We never...
Cute and also easy to draw. I remember, I can't remember what his name was, but it was the artist that designed the character, Kirby. And he was like, why did you do it? He was like, well, I wanted a character that was easy to draw so that kids sitting in school could sketch it without worrying if they'd done a good job or not.
Yeah.
And I was like, the Amabie fits that criteria too, right? Like anyone can sketch an Amabie and feel a little bit better.
Definitely.
And so,
okay, so then if people want to keep up with your work, where's the best place to send them?
I mean, really the best place is on Twitter.
Okay.
That's by far where I'm most active. Like, I had a website, Hyakumonogatari, but honestly, I abandoned it years ago. I mean, I've written a few things on it, but that was my amateur website when I had a lot of time. And now that people actually pay me to do all this stuff, I don't do as much, free stuff. So, like, that's the worst place to send people because, once again, it's been fairly abandoned.
Gotcha.
Twitter is probably the most active. I have my own website, zackdavisson.com, that also has my current projects.
Awesome.
And that's it.
And what's the handle? Is it? It was just Zack _Davisson?
Just Zack Davisson.
Zack. Okay, all one word. Just Zack Davisson.
Yeah, I find that as an author, I want to be found, and so I try my best to be very findable instead of trying to hide behind crazy code names.
Yōkai Yūrei Lovers 72 or something.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Zack, thank you so much. It was fascinating talking to you, and I would love to talk to you again sometime. So
anytime. Yeah, reach out to me. So thanks so much.
Awesome.
All right, good talking to you.
So one last time, the name of the book is Yūrei, the Japanese Ghost. I highly recommend it. The second edition is out now. You can use the link in the show notes or japankyo.com/Amazon. And of course, Zack has so much more work that you can go check out. All that Mizuki Shigeru stuff that he's worked on. Also, by the way, if you're interested in finding out more about Mizuki Shigeru, Zack wrote an absolutely wonderful article about the life of Mizuki Shigeru. He wrote it right after Mizuki Shigeru passed away a few years ago. And so it's like a heartfelt article kind of reflecting on Mizuki Shigeru's life and importance. And I really, really enjoyed it. And there's just so much interesting stuff there that is really eye-opening if you don't know much about Mizuki Shigeru. It makes you want to find out so much more about him. So I will include the link to that article in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or if you're working on any Japan-related projects, let me know. mail@japanstationpodcast.com. You can send me an email. Remember to subscribe. That is the number one free thing you can do to support the show. Subscribe. And you can follow on Facebook and Twitter @JapanKyo News. Thank you to Unomi for providing the theme song. And that does it for episode 50. Come back for episode 51 on November 1st because, I'm just going to say it was truly an honor to get to talk to my next guest because he is one of the leading experts on the history of Edo. All right. So before Tokyo was Tokyo, it was called Edo. And it was a fascinating place. And my guest, Dr. Timon Screech, knows all about it. And in his latest book, Tokyo Before Tokyo, he really paints a picture of what it was like to be in Edo. I loved the book. And I really, really enjoyed getting to talk to him. So that episode is recorded. It's ready to go. Come back for that on November 1st. And one last thing, there is a new episode of Ichimon Japan out now, and it's all about Japan's equivalent of, I guess you could say, the Chupacabra or Bigfoot, a Japanese cryptid known as the Tsuchinoko. And there is so much to say about the Tsuchinoko. I did tons and tons of research into the topic. So go check that out at japankyo.com/Ichimon Japan, wherever you get your podcasts, link in the show notes. All right. So thank you for listening. And remember, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!